and human geography. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are for the all-important Industry and Economic Development Unit, technically Unit 7. We cover it as Unit 6. We got one more to go after this. Obviously, we are operating under unusual circumstances as we come to you live to discuss industrialization and economic development. Make sure you have seen my other videos from this week before you watch this. All right, folks, we're going to cover the industry part of this. There's a separate economic development slide presentation that will be covered separately as part of the next folder. So we're covering slides 1 through 39. I'm going to fly, and here's why. Some of this we've already covered before, and the other reason is it's 39 slides, and I don't want to take up any more of your time than I need to. Now, you must watch this because you must come up with a review question that you post in the ensuing discussion post for each of the sets of 8 slides. So you got to come up with 5 review questions based on this presentation. Questions that you need more clarification on. And I will be giving you that in a successive Zoom meeting after spring break. Okay, let's get going. All right, and let's get this baby started. So you covered the Industrial Revolution last week very briefly. You better have. If not, here's a quick review of it. Remember, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we have something called the cottage industry. That is where goods are produced at home. What that usually meant was in a particular town, community, there might be one person or a few that could make a product. They made it from beginning to middle to end. They were skilled and they were valued, but you were limited in terms of how much you could produce based on how much these individuals could, working by hand with very limited tools. Well, all of this changes thanks to new inventions that are developed in agriculture, in industry. We call it the Industrial Revolution. As you know, new technologies, right? The cotton gin, the seed drill, right? The steam engine, the railroad. All of these products come together around the same time thanks to the development of these machines and new innovations. It also because of the availability of natural resources, right? You got to have those resources to turn them into energy or finished products. And this was needed. These natural resources were needed for industrialization to take place. And of course, places that had a lot of these resources or acquired a lot of these resources, like Great Britain, tended to benefit a lot. Remember the effects of this, right? New technology like the steam engine, availability of natural resources, suddenly iron, water, power, coal, all are needed in order to industrialize, leads to the Industrial Revolution. What are the impacts? Well, suddenly we have much more food produced than ever before, right? So our population grows, our food supply increases. People flock to cities. That's where the jobs are. We need a lot fewer farmers because of the machinery, and so those former farmers come to the cities along with others looking for work. We have new changes to the social structure. Usually that meant a lot more workers, a lot fewer farmers, and so our society would begin to move a lot more into stage 2 and take on secondary jobs as opposed to primary. Of course, this also contributed, remember, to overseas expansion, to colonialism and imperialism, because European countries led by Great Britain and later on the U.S. Were looking for those raw materials and markets to sell their products in. So again, follow the path of the Industrial Revolution. That's really the path of development worldwide, right? Where it starts are the places that are developed today, and for the most part. And as you can see, it slowly moves to other parts of the world. Industrialization does, and those areas tend to lag behind the core regions where it started. Again, started in Great Britain, spreads to Europe, shortly after to North America. You'll notice over time, in some instances close to 100 years later or more, it begins to spread to Africa and into South America and Asia. All right, know the path. All right, England to Europe and the United States. And then I should say England to Europe and English colonies. And then eventually it trickles down to the rest of the world. Definitely a hierarchical diffusion path. All right, let's take a look at economic sectors. Remember, economic sectors are divided up. So a economic sector is basically where your jobs are. Every job belongs in a particular sector. There are 5 of them. Earlier in the year, I introduced you to 3. Guess what? You're going to get 2 new ones right now. The first is primary. You should be familiar with this. Primary sector jobs are jobs where you extract some sort of resource from earth. So farmers are primary. Fishermen are. Forestry is primary. Oil extraction is primary, right? So any process where you are taking or extracting raw materials from earth, all right? Most less developed places, most developing places, as we like to say, have more primary jobs. So a larger percentage of their population works in primary. If you are mostly in primary, you have not developed a lot. You have not really industrialized yet. When you do industrialize, you start to see most of your workers shift to secondary work. Secondary is where you've now taken raw materials, you turn them into a useful product, you manufacture them into something. So any product, any job where you're taking your raw material and turning it into something finished is secondary. So every factory worker, even a baker, right? Because they're taking, sugar and dough and these other things and turning them into finished products, right? Carpenters, right? Builders, construction work, obviously, so it makes up a much, much larger percentage of an industrialized country's workforce, right? The way that I think I can look at this is if you think about U.S. like in the 1700s, early 1800s, we were primary. Then once the Industrial Revolution hits, people move to cities and they start taking secondary jobs, all right? As you can imagine, in developing places, a lot more primary and secondary jobs. All right. In more developed places, you get much higher level jobs, and we're about to get into those right now. Tertiary jobs, remember, are jobs that involve goods and services. So you don't actually make anything, right? You don't produce something. You're providing a service or exchanging services and goods to other people. So if you work in the service sector, that means sales, right? Retail. It can be any level of, it can be a lot of different education levels, right? Because it can be everything from retail sales, right? Customer service. It can be lawyers and doctors, teachers, right? Politicians. They're not making anything, right? They're providing services to others. What you find is in core countries, in developed countries or developed regions, a huge percentage of the jobs fall into this category. So you switch, and it's the developing countries that handle primary and secondary, and most of your workforce is in tertiary or higher. A lot of that has to do with education. All right. Now, I want to introduce you to 2 other. All right. Quaternary, right, is the 4th level of economic sector. That's if you work in any sort of research and development job. So it's a special type of tertiary. Scientists, researchers, all right. R&D, they oftentimes call this. These are particularly important. I would kind of call them almost like STEM jobs in modern times because they help to develop new innovations and new products that can spark the economy and new economic activity. And finally, quinary is the 5th level. These are the high-level decision makers, all right? So we're talking about the CEOs of companies. We're talking about high-level government leaders like the president and governors and the secretaries in his cabinet, all right? Quinary are the folks whose decisions impact the rest of us more commonly, right? If Mr. M makes a decision, quite frankly, that's going to affect like 150 students, but not a lot of other people, all right? Whereas high-level decision makers, when a company head, right, or a political leader, or a university president makes a decision that has the potential to impact thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, okay? I tell you these, and by the way, as you might imagine, core countries have a lot higher tertiary, quaternary, and quinary, and developing places have more primary, secondary, all right? Anyways, let's move it on. We were introduced to this earlier in the year. I introduced you to those sectors because, remember, there's a theory out there called Wallerstein's world system that divides the world up into 3 categories: core, periphery, and semi-periphery. So core at the top, periphery are at the bottom, semi-periphery are countries that are in the middle. And as you can see, it's color-coded here. And Wallerstein argued that because of economic sectors and activity, that the world is divided into these 3 classes. And basically, the long story short is The core takes advantage of the other two in order to get wealthy off of the other two's resources. All right? The semi-periphery, oftentimes, while it's being taken advantage of by the core for resources and workers, is doing the same thing to the periphery. So the periphery, the poorest countries, the ones at the bottom, tend to get taken advantage of by everybody else, not just the wealthy, but those in the middle as well. It's kind of a pessimistic theory, all right? And it really criticizes what we call our capitalistic world model. Anyways, again, what Wallerstein says is the core are democratic governments. They have high wages for their populations. What do they import? They import raw materials from the rest of the world. What do they produce? Products with those raw materials that they sell to the rest of the world. They get a lot of the world's money. Most of the world's investment stays in the core. All right. They're wealthy enough to be able to provide welfare services to their population, so their people get healthier, they live longer, they're more productive, and so they benefit the most from this system. All right. Meanwhile, countries at the bottom are usually non-democratic, and they export their raw materials. The best thing would be to keep them in their own country, but they can't develop them, so they end up exporting them to the core, who gets wealthy off of them. Meanwhile, they end up having to buy the manufactured products from the core, all right, at the core's prices. Generally speaking, their workers make far less wages. In fact, most of them struggle to survive, and because their countries are so poor, there are just no services available for the people, so they don't live as long, they don't make as much money, they have lower quality jobs. And then, of course, you have the semi-periphery. These are the folks that are in the middle. These are the growing countries like China and Brazil and Mexico. They used to be periphery, but they've grown to the point of being in the middle. Oftentimes, right, as I've mentioned, their wages are low and their services provided are low, but it's gotten better than it used to be. And it's gotten better because they're copying the core model, and more they're taking from the periphery as well. So what it leads to is a world where you have three classes of countries: the very rich, kind of the middle, and then this growing group that are poor countries that can never really escape this system. All right? Wallerstein's arguing this needs to change, and we need to invest in the periphery a lot more. All right, we're changing directions here, and we're moving over to specifically manufacturing. And what you need to know with manufacturing is there are different factors that determine where a factory, where a company, an industry is going to locate, a company or an industry. And these factors are first labor. In modern times, labor is really important, right? Because where you locate can determine whether you have to pay your worker $30 an hour or $5 an hour, right? And so it can have a huge impact on how much profit your company can make and how much cost it has. Labor wasn't as important as it used to be. Now it's the most important factor. In the past, transportation was, but transportation's gotten so efficient and so cheap that the biggest factor to determine where companies locate today is, in fact, labor costs. All right. So companies that used to be located in the northern U.S. have either located to the southern U.S., where wages are lower, or they've located overseas, right? They've gone to Mexico or even into Asia to find those workers who can do the job at the lowest possible cost. Other factors, transportation, and I've mentioned this already. Again, it used to be the most important cost factor. Now it's not, and the reason is because of what we call containerization. We've developed a system, and I want you to think of every truck that you see. Do you notice how they have the same, what are we going to call it, a trailer that they are carrying? You notice how it's that same rectangular shape? Hey, that's standardized. That's intentional. What that means is that every truck's product can essentially be loaded and unloaded across the world at what we call break of bulk points. Any point where you can take one cargo and switch it to another. So from ship to land, right? From air to ship. So seaports and airports are usually break of bulk points. And the idea is if we use the same container, we can do it much more fast, much more efficient. We have these massive container ships that we can load with these things. And so transportation costs have come way down. On top of that, by the way, many of these containers are refrigerated, and so products can be transported much longer distances. Thanks to this containerization, everything is so standardized and efficient that transportation costs have come way down. Again, a breakup bulk point, also known as an entrepot, is in any location where products are switched from one method of transportation to another. All right? I'm going to get into the least cost theory in a moment. Markets. Markets are where you sell your product. That also influences where companies will locate, right? You want to be close to your markets if at all possible. Because then you can supply your product a lot faster to the public as needed. And finally, natural resources. Natural resources matter, right? That's another factor that a company has to take into account. How close to the resources can we be? They're probably going to want to balance somewhere between the natural resources and the markets. Speaking of which, let's get into this least cost theory. It was developed by a German economist named Alfred Weber. All right, that W sounds like a V. What Weber argued is that an industry is going to locate, right, based on the owner's desire to minimize transportation and labor costs and to try to maximize what he called agglomeration economies. First, Weber argued that a company is going to locate in order to reduce their most expensive transportation costs. That means they might locate closer to the raw material, right, that they need to make their product, or they may locate closer to the market needed to sell their material, depending on at which point the product is heaviest. All right, so they're going to weigh all of this out. I have another slide after this that helps to explain. Agglomeration is when you locate close to similar firms. You do this in order to take advantage of similar facilities like warehouses or infrastructure that you might both use. Sometimes it actually makes sense for you to locate close to similar firms. This oftentimes leads to clusters of industries or businesses that locate near one another so that they can take advantage of the same workers, right? Skilled workers, or infrastructure, or warehousing, or other facilities that they can all use together. A good example of this is up north in Northern California. We have an area called Silicon Valley. That's where a lot of our, e-commerce companies and our internet companies, our .coms are located, so that they can all really take advantage of having those skilled workers that come out of the universities in that area. So Weber argued companies are going to agglomerate sometimes, and they're most importantly going to locate based on reducing their transportation costs. So Weber, where should the company locate? Well, Weber says if it's bulk reducing, which means the product at sale weighs less than the materials needed to make it, then you should locate it closer to where the materials are produced. That's going to reduce transportation costs the most, right? Metals like iron, steel, and copper. Guys, think of how much earth has to be extracted in order to get that iron, steel, and copper. They extract massive tons worth of earth and end up getting relatively small pieces of iron, steel, and copper out of it. That's bulk reducing, right? The material needed to produce that product is much heavier. They have to extract it, they have to load it onto trucks, and they have to carry that heavy, heavy earth to a facility in order to extract the iron, the steel, or the copper. That's going to be, when they're done, they've got some much smaller pieces of iron, steel, and copper, so it's much cheaper to transport that to the market to sell it. Therefore, they're going to locate closer to the iron ore pits, right? Where the cost is the most because it's the heaviest to transport. Same with, think about paper mills, all right? Hey, trees are heavy. And so paper mills tend to locate close to the forests where the trees are extracted. They're far from the cities where the paper is sold because the paper, to move that, is much cheaper because the paper weighs a heck of a lot less than the tree that had to be transported to produce it. All right, agriculture is the same way. A lot of crops are heavier than the processed food. Think about it, like corn chips, right? A bag of tortilla chips. Think of all the corn that had to be transported in order to make that chip. So usually the actual food processing places are close to the agricultural site. Okay? The opposite of bulk reducing is a bulk gaining industry. This is where the finished product at sale is actually heavier than the individual materials needed to make it. Generally, these are located closer to the markets because that will reduce transportation costs for this type of company. A good example is beverages. Cans are usually shipped empty, and then they are filled at the very last possible moment at facilities right outside of the cities in which they are sold. Another good example of a bulk gaining industry automobiles or any machinery. Those individual pieces are shipped to the facilities, and then the car or the machinery is assembled at the very last minute before it is sent to the market to be sold. That way, the heaviest part of the process, right, when the product is put together, has to be transported the least amount of time. So Weber argues if you're bulk reducing, locate closer to your materials. If you're bulk gaining, locate closer to your markets. All right? Now I want to point out to you, labor changes, right, and transportation costs reducing, right, have changed all this. These suddenly are a lot different than when Weber came up with this theory. Now labor is probably more important than transportation because it's so cheap to transport things around the world today. Hey, you already saw this model earlier. We spent a lot of time on it, so I'm not going to spend a lot. This is the other model, the model that contradicts the Wallerstein, the world system. This is Rostow's model. Remember, he argued that every country is going to go through 5 stages of development. He argues it's like steps or a ladder. Every country is going to get there. Countries that are in stage 2 or stage 3 are developing. Countries that are in 4 and 5 are developed. And so every country's getting there. They go at their own pace, if you remember. By the way, stage 1, he said, is just agricultural. Remember, there are no countries that are in that still. Every country in the world is at least at stage 2. Criticisms of Rostow, remember, are that it kind of it tends to overvalue capitalism, I guess. I guess the word I'm saying is it gives a really positive view of capitalism because it's basically saying, hey, even if you're in a poor country right now, good news, at some point in the future, your country will be better off, so just stick with it. It also doesn't account for the fact that some countries in modern times seem to have skipped over stages. And so it doesn't help to explain a lot of countries that are outside of Europe and North America. All right? I think it's important that we do watch a Rostow video here as part of our own. All right? Okay, so as you can see, I'm not going to play the full 11-minute video. You need to watch it. All right? There's actually a real good opportunity for practice questions out of that. Hey, we also covered this theory in the past. It was the dependency theory. And it just kind of argued, remember, it's similar to the world systems. Remember, it argues that, that peripheral countries are dependent on core countries. The labor and the raw materials goes to the core. The goods go back to the peripheral. And remember, what Dependency argued is that a lot of leaders in peripheral countries actually like this because it guarantees that they get products that they can then use to benefit those that support them. All right? Hey, commodity dependence. Commodity dependence is when your country is more than half of their revenue comes from agriculture or raw materials that you send to other places. Guys, the problem with commodity dependence is all of your wealthy raw materials are going to benefit other countries. You're getting very little benefit or value from it, okay? Generally, countries that are commodity dependent are developing. They are peripheral. And then the countries that are not tend to be core and tend to be able to really take advantage of those valuable commodities and turn them into finished products in their home country, all right? Lots of things are happening around the world that are geographic, and you have to be familiar with them. All right. We're going to hit on a number of different topics involving industry that have a geographic spin. So, due to the fact that international trade's increasing and there's a growing interdependence in the world, there are 2 concepts that establish the basis for trade. All right. They are called complementarity and comparative advantage. We need to spend a little time on each of these. Complementarity is the degree to which one place can supply something that another place demands. If you have a complementary good, what that means is you have something that other people want. Florida has a lot of complementarity, right, with northeastern U.S. cities. They want fresh fruits and vegetables, like citrus. Florida provides that, right? Northeastern can't do it themselves. They don't have the climate to do it. California has a lot of complementarity for a lot of agricultural products as well because of our Mediterranean climate. All right? Comparative advantage is a situation in which a country, an individual, a company, or a region can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than a competitor. So, hey, here we have an advantage in producing something because we can do it cheaper and better than you can. So, I'm going to give you an example. The US and Colombia. Both countries need coffee and wheat in order to subsist, right? In order to survive, right? The US can outproduce Colombia in wheat, obviously. We can outproduce almost anybody when it comes to wheat, right? We can also outproduce them in coffee if we wanted to, right? If we wanted to, right? But we won't do both, right? And sell some to Colombia while Colombia sits back and does nothing. Instead, what we will do is we will say, you know what? We'll focus on the wheat, all right? Because we can actually produce more and think we're more ideal to do it better. Let's let Colombia focus on the coffee. They have a better climate for it. We would have to invest more in order to do that. We would have to add greenhouses and other things like that in order to make it work. They're more naturally inclined to make it. So they have a comparative advantage over us because of the climate there, right? Countries that have a lot of oil have a comparative advantage over those that do not when it comes to energy, all right? And so a country needs to figure out its complementarity, right? And it needs to figure out comparative and use that complementarity to create a comparative advantage with other countries around the world. This is how a country develops according to Rostow. They get a comparative advantage and then they use that. Whether that's workers like places like China, whether that's energy like places like Nigeria, whether that's minerals throughout the rest of Africa, whether that's agricultural crops, right, like tropical countries. You figure out what your advantage is and then that's what you exploit to develop. All right? This is a great example, right? Australia and the United Kingdom. The UK's climate doesn't allow it to specialize in peers, right? Australia can. The cost of doing so is cheaper, so that means they should. Excuse me. Globalization, we know what that is, right? That's the interconnectedness of all of us. And of course, there are new organizations that have been created to connect us more economically, to promote trade, to bring us more together. This is part of the reason why things like coronavirus and all that are able to spread, right? Because globalization has us more interconnected with others around the rest of the world more so than ever before. All right. Some good examples of globalization. The EU, right? Remember, has eliminated trade restrictions throughout Europe. We have a world organization known as the World Trade Organization that tries to eliminate tariffs and other trade barriers. Remember, we have organizations like OPEC, which is oil-producing countries, in order to control production as well. Right, and here's some good examples of these. The EU, promote development, right, through economic and political cooperation, eliminate tariffs, foster growth. WTO, reduce tariffs, all right, to trade, try to allow us to trade more. Mercosur, right, remember that's a free trade area between Europe and South American countries, and then OPEC is another example of these trade relationships designed to promote globalization, to improve people's comparative advantages so the products can get to the rest of the world. How can governments affect development and industry? Well, there's a lot of ways. One, a lot of the times a government's debt a country or an industry's finances can lead to a country or global financial crisis, all right? If economies or industries falter, then that can lead to major national or global financial problems. And we're seeing that right now because of this virus. Industries like the airlines, right, have shut down. And as a result of that, it's leading to just billions and billions of dollars of losses around the world in other industries. And so that's going to be a drain on the world economy. And this is because of our economic system where everybody is interconnected and globalized and dependent. Right? If we were subsistence, we'd make a lot fewer products. They wouldn't be as great. But one area of the world's suffering would not affect other areas as much. Other ways that economies have become more connected. The UN and other groups have created, remember this, loaning or lending organizations. One of them's the IMF, one of them's the World Bank. Remember, they give out hundreds of millions of dollars in loans every single year to countries, right, or to regions that are looking to develop their infrastructure, their business, their health, to try to promote development. One other way, microlending. Microlending is when individuals like you and I go on a GoFundMe or go on any other source and we supply loans to people in other countries in order to help them with development projects. Microlending has become an incredibly valuable way for LDCs to boost their production through individual loans from individuals in wealthier countries. How does this interdependence, globalization, affect the geography of countries? Well, I mentioned to you already, it can lead to global financial problems. A national crisis now is global, right? And again, this virus that started in China has now spread around the world and really crushed the world economy. We are seeing a shift, right, in manufacturing. It used to be in the core. Now it's moving over to the periphery. So factories that used to be located in the U.S. now located in Mexico and China, for instance. All right. We're noticing that the world is starting to consume more energy, consume more resources. This is because a lot of the developing world, like China and India, are gaining wealth, and they're starting to copy the behavior of countries like the U.S. and in Europe. And finally, the roles of women in the workforce are changing. As a country develops, it educates women, it eliminates inequality. Women are usually a measure of how developed a country is. Other effects of globalization, outsourcing. We've covered this already. Loss of jobs in developed places, in manufacturing regions. The old manufacturing regions of the 18 and 1900s have been hurt. And they've lost a lot of their factories, they lost a lot of their workers. And these workers have relocated to other areas within countries. The United States is a really good example of this, right? We have an area of the country known as the Rust Belt, right, up near the Great Lakes, which has lost a lot of people because the jobs have left and they've moved down to the south, to the area we call the Sun Belt. And so the workers have followed. Population has shifted. All right. Want to introduce you to a new term, footloose industry. It's a term for an industry that can really be placed at any location without any effect from factors such as resource and transport. These industries are usually fixed, which means the costs of production don't ever change for them. There aren't a lot of footloose industries anymore. All right. There are very few industries that can basically locate wherever they want. There's always factors or costs at play. A couple of other specific geographic terms you need to know. I want to introduce you to something called an SEZ. It's a special economic zone. Some countries have introduced these specific areas within their country, usually at a port or right along the border, in which tax and other incentives are given to foreign companies to locate there. All right, so again, Mexico has a number of these right along the border, and they basically give benefits to U.S. companies to locate there. You don't have to pay taxes. You don't have to pay for the land. We'll give you all these other incentives. What's the benefit for Mexico? Those companies come in and tend to pay workers higher than other companies located in Mexico would. These factories are known as maquiladoras, and they are located all along the border region, which is an SEZ that Mexico has created specifically with the United States. They provide local and international businesses with incentives to invest in those areas, to build infrastructure, roads, electrical systems, to locate factories there. And then they don't have to pay workers as much, and they don't have to pay taxes like they would have to in the United States. Other SEZs are now located in China, a place known as the Shenzhen region, and a part of Malaysia as well. They are a really popular way for a developing country to attract foreign business, to attract companies to locate there so that you can boost wages for your workers. One thing, most of the time, the products produced here cannot be sold in that country. They have to be shipped to a core country to be sold. All right. I've already talked about free trade zones, right? Free trade zones are areas where there are no tariffs or taxes that countries put on one another. These are very popular as a way to boost each other's comparative advantages. EPZs are similar to SEZs. An EPZ is an area of the country that again is designed to attract foreign investment. It's also designed to expand your industry and your technology. So this again is done in developing countries. All right. Again, what it is an export processing zone where foreign businesses are allowed to locate. They can partner with your national businesses. You use workers in your country. But again, all of the products have to be exported overseas. They're not allowed to be sold in the actual country where they're produced because the country doesn't really want its national companies to be threatened or challenged by these superior products. So when EPZ is popular in China, China uses them to attract American and European businesses. They use Chinese workers who are paid less. It also causes these companies to invest in technology and infrastructure in China. Hey folks, we have what are known today as an International Division of Labor. And really what that means is we have basically developed a system where work industry isn't just in the core anymore. Now more and more companies are headquartered in the core, but the actual industry, the actual work is being done in developing in peripheral or semi-peripheral areas. All right, and this is a maquiladora. This is one of these special factories that's created in an SEZ. This is a recent change we see on Earth's surface in border regions where developing countries can try to take advantage of the wealth of neighboring developed countries. All right. Folks, we have a number of other new changes to industry that have occurred. All right. One of them is called post-Fordism. In the past, we used a Fordist assembly line method. We tried to mass produce products, right? As many as possible in a short amount of time. Today, post-Fordism is working more efficiently. We call it working leaner, all right? You try to produce based on demand. And that's kind of specific to what the needs are of the public at that time. You don't just try to produce as much as possible. I'm going to get into multiplier and economies of scale after spring break. Agglomeration I've already talked about. Just-in-time delivery is a new concept where companies oftentimes want products shipped to them right when they need them. If you have a factory that has a bunch of your products or materials occupying space, that's taking up space. That's costing you time. It's costing you money. And so nowadays we're moving to something called just-in-time delivery, where companies want the product they need to build their products. They want the materials needed to build their products like the day of or the night before. And so what that means is we have to be more interconnected, and a lot of suppliers have to be located closer to the assembly, to the big company, more so than ever before. All right. I've already talked about how in some areas we're seeing certain businesses cluster together with agglomeration. Here's a great example up in Silicon Valley. You have these incredible universities around this area, right? You have banks that give out a lot of money for loans. And so as a result, all of these companies located here to take advantage of these changes. All right, so you can see this is called a technopole, where a bunch of technology companies located in one area, they cluster to take advantage of shared resources they can technically use together. In this instance, a skilled and talented workforce. Right to work is another concept you need to know. Right to work laws is one of the reasons why we've seen industry shift in the United States. Right to work laws are laws that say anybody can work in a state. They don't have to be a member of a union. Unions generally help workers to get higher wages. And so businesses don't especially love labor unions, right? Because workers get paid more in heavily unionized states. So what some states have done, these are the red states here, they've developed laws that say a worker doesn't have to belong to the union in order to work in that industry. That's good for those industries because they can locate there and they can individually negotiate with workers and pay them a lower wage than if they negotiated with the entire union as one. So the right to work states tend to be states that aren't great for unions and workers as a whole, but they're good for business and tend to be good for workers maybe in specific areas of that state. It's attractive to companies that want to keep unions out. So you can really see where unions are strong here based on the states that do not have right to work laws. All right. Oh, that's it. We're stopping there. We're going to pick up our next presentation here with slide 40, and we're going to review the development stuff really quickly. Mr. M signing out. Thanks for following along. 40 minutes is a long time. You guys have been amazing. Don't forget to watch the Rostow video. It's 11 minutes. It's embedded within this presentation. I need 5 questions, clarifying questions from this PowerPoint. There's tons that you could ask, so I better see some good ones in the discussion post. Mr. M signing out. All right, have a great day, everybody.